Joining us now is writer and commentator on Talk TV, my good friend Esther Krakue, who has been shedding light on some of the latest absurd examples of reparations. Esther, great to see you. Are you ashamed of Britain's colonial past?
Well, I mean, the thing is history, right? You can't rewrite it. You can't sugarcoat it. The reality stands as it stands. But I find that a lot of people that call for sort of reparations around sort of slavery reparations, for instance, take a very ahistorical view of sort of the British Empire, colonialism, but also slavery as well, and its kind of place in human history. Slavery is nothing new to the human condition. And I think the way that, it's discussed as if, someone of present day owes someone of present day who never experienced slavery some sort of reparations is absolutely ridiculous. I'm not sure if you were made aware of the example in the UK, particularly with this debate, but the BBC's very own Laura Trevillian of the very well-known Trevillian family has paid £100,000 to the Grenadian government as a form of sort of slavery reparations for the fact that her family owned 1,000 slaves across various plantations on Grenada. And the irony was that the actual compensation that her family received for ending sort of slavery or to getting rid of their slaves was around, in today's money, £3 million. So she didn't actually even pay up to 10% of the money that her family received for getting rid of their slaves. But for somehow she is fronting that as some sort of beacon of morality. And this obsession with slavery reparations is just a way for these white liberals to spit shine their halos in public and show how virtuous they are, when really they take a very ahistorical view of actual history and the nuances of these discussions.
James.
Well, I mean, it is ahistorical too, because, I mean, let's just be frank about it. It was the British Navy and the British Empire which did more to end slavery than any other group, organization, military country in the history of the world. Is that correct?
Well, yes, absolutely. And, I even made the point in my piece that I wrote for the Daily Mail that, another jurisdiction that's called for slavery reparations is San Francisco recently, who's called for millions of dollars to be freed up for black residents as a form of slavery reparations. I actually have family that live in San Francisco and we're part of the Akan tribe in Ghana. The Akans actually made a lot of money off the slave trade, and it didn't actually end until the British staunchly said, we're not going to be buying more slaves off you, and forcibly ended it in that part of the world. Wouldn't it be ironic for them to now receive slavery reparations even though their ancestors were enriched by the slave trade? These are the kind of nuanced discussions that we don't have. Even Ethiopia, for instance, formally ended slavery after pressure from the British I think in the mid-1940s, right? They were one of the latest African societies to end slavery. So this idea that, history is not nuanced and that for some reason white people have been casted as these sinful slavers and should pay some reparations is completely ahistoric, and it completely misses the nuances that in that same vein, there's so many people in Britain that could claim slavery reparations for the Norman Conquest, or for, Irish people for the Irish famine, or, even black Africans for the Arab slave trade of black Africans, which was far more brutal than the transatlantic slave trade. There's so many instances in history where this, which demonstrates how nuanced this discussion is.
And it was good to see some pushback then when we had Penny Wong make those comments in London. Your Foreign Secretary, James Cleverly, he came out and he said, well, have a look at our government. We've got the Prime Minister who's got an Asian background. James Cleverly himself has got an African background, and I think the Home Minister's also got an Asian background. So isn't that proof that there is equal opportunity and we don't need to talk about reparations, that anyone can become leader of a country?
Absolutely, and I think it's a testament to how far this country has come. But it also just demonstrates how actually divisive such a policy would be if we empowered the government to try to sort out every member of society and say, actually, you deserve reparations and you don't. What happens to a person of mixed racial heritage where their father was presumably descendants of slaves, and their mother was descendants of slavers? Exactly, who gets to pay? And so I think that was a perfect response to how far we've come. But also, there's nothing moral about making people today who had nothing to do with the slave trade, either as slaves or slavers, to pay for something of the past.
James?
Well, one of the things, Esther, which I find really, really interesting in this whole thing, we see this here, we saw with the Penny Wong thing, which we talked about before, we see it with the reparations debate there and in the United States. Much of this seems to be an attempt to undermine the entire, Anglo-Saxon, for lack of a better term, heritage of Britain, the United States, in Australia. It seems like there's a real anti-Enlightenment push here, too, because once you start undermining those foundations, you really start to go against liberal democracy, representative government, and the idea that we are all individuals with one person, one vote, and all of the things that we fought for centuries for. What do you think about that?
Well, I think that's a very fair argument, but I think, you know, it boils down to the fact that this is just greed. There's such an intellectual incoherence with many of the proponents of slavery reparations these days that it just boils down to greed. I often make the point that, you know, many African Americans that are clamoring for slavery reparations certainly wouldn't trade their American passports for any African passport. So they're very well aware that they're in a much better position than the Africans who weren't shipped overseas to be slaves. And that should factor into the discussion. I also talk about it on the African front. You know, how many African countries have been, you know, recipients of billions at this point of pounds worth of foreign Western aid that only goes to enrich the pockets of dictators and despots, while actual Africans hardly ever see the benefits of that money. So again, it is a very, very nuanced discussion, but I don't give, you know, the people that try and engage in this discussion meaningfully as I don't give them the credit of being genuine or intelligent or trying to divide society. I just think it's pure greed.